Thanks for joining us. My name is Ibrahim Sani. As the economy continues to recover, we're looking at more travel, both leisure as well as personal and business. We're looking at how people can actually move forward when it comes to trying to enjoy their travels, at the same time reduce cost, but most importantly trying to improve on the experience. Like I said before, we're looking at just lodgings, we're looking now at towards experiences as well. So joining us in the studio is Mich Goh, travelling all the way from Singapore?
Yeah, that's right.
Singapore. Joining us from Singapore, Mich Goh is of course the Airbnb Head of Public Policy for Southeast Asia, Hong Kong and Taiwan. Mich, thanks for taking the time to come over to the show. This is your second time on the show, and of course it's always important for me to have this conversation face to face. I want to look into the whole situation of travel right now, perhaps take stock into the situation as tourism continues to gradually resume. How have global trends changed past the pandemic and of course heading towards a pre-pandemic world?
Yeah, of course.
Post-pandemic world.
Thanks for having me and good morning also, Ibrahim. So I think the past 2.5 years have been really challenging for the travel industry and for people involved in tourism. But I think thankfully travel restrictions have lifted and borders have largely reopened. So we're really seeing a strong intent to travel from guests on our platform. Here in Malaysia, that's also the case. So KL is actually the second most searched destinations globally for us in the second half of last year.
KL.
And that means, yeah, so that actually means search intent has increased the most, or second most for KL.
Is this, so maybe you can share with us the top 5 maybe?
So I can share the top 2. So the one that's above KL is Bali.
Okay.
So Southeast Asia destinations, I think.
Okay, so we lost only to Bali.
Yeah.
That's not bad.
Yes,
That's not bad at all.
Exactly. And also KL and other domestic cities are becoming increasingly popular also amongst domestic travelers here in Malaysia. So we're seeing a large intent to travel again. And we know also that travel has changed, but that some of the trends that we're seeing come out of the pandemic have endured post-pandemic as well.
Let's talk about that, the things that have endured pre and post.
So I think one thing that we really saw happen during COVID was that travel stays were lengthening. So maybe because people had more flexibility when they were working or they were largely working from home, they were able to work from other places, and we saw bookings lengthen on our platform. That has endured post-pandemic as well. So even though business travel has returned, I think the flexibility that people have when it comes to travel, to work and to travel means that they're blending both of it. And so longer stays are still continuing to happen on our platform.
Maybe you can compare and contrast the types of experiences that we're facing right now at the local level, not just KL but Malaysia, considering that you're looking at a few other markets as well. Are things different here for folks that want to come to KL?
I think things are largely, I think the trends in Malaysia are largely also what we're seeing happening around the world and around the region. But I think also another thing that is quite big here in Malaysia is domestic travel. So domestic travel into Penang, for example, was about 50% of all stays in the state. So we know that Malaysians like to travel, and we know that they like to explore their country as well.
Okay, what opportunities do you think that tourism does provide for when it comes to local communities in Malaysia and across the region?
Yeah, so travel I think has the opportunity to bring a lot of economic opportunity to certain areas. And so now I think as you see more and more people explore areas outside of the typical tourist area, they also bring tourism dollars to these local communities. So when someone is hosting a listing in a specific area that may not be as touristy as previously before, you see more money going there, you see spending going towards the restaurants, the shops around the area, you see things like cleaning services, laundry services also increasing in the area. So we think tourism really has the opportunity to help uplift economic opportunity to local areas and local communities.
When we look at the tourism industry and of course just travel industry, what would be some of the ideas that you can share with us when it comes to the travelers' intentions and hopes in terms of doing these kind of travels?
So I think the resurgence in travel or the travel recovery has also come at a time where the global economy is slowing a little bit. So we see a strong trend towards a desire for more value for money types of travel. So this extends beyond just accommodation, but also towards things like flights, activities that they do when they travel. So we see a trend towards value for money travel. The other thing that we are also seeing is that there is a strong desire for unique accommodation. So I think because during COVID, people were largely confined to their local area or to their hometown, there is a desire to look for more interesting types of spaces when they go on a holiday. So everything from tree houses to villas by the beach, those types of experiences are things that people are starting to look for more and more when they travel.
When we look at the trends moving forward, sustainability is going to be a key feature. How has sustainability been seen in the travel industry and perhaps even in the light of how Airbnb does your listings?
Yeah, of course. So I think to us at Airbnb, sustainability means more than just environmental sustainability. It also includes sustainability from an economic standpoint, from a cultural standpoint. And so we see a strong desire by travelers now to look for things that are more sustainable and that help them contribute to local communities when they travel. So they're starting to make travel decisions also based on whether or not that travel is sustainable, from everything ranging to environmental sustainability to making sure that when they visit a local area that they're doing things that are authentic to the area and that are culturally relevant to the area as well.
So what is the difference between ecotourism and green travel?
I think it's largely the same thing, but ecotourism, I think here in Malaysia, is defined quite specifically as travel to places that are involved in nature. I think green travel is more broadly thinking about the choices that you make when you make travel decisions, everything from the type of accommodation that you choose to the type of flights or mode of transport in which you travel on, and choices that you make also when you're actually on a trip.
When we look at Airbnb's point of view, is green tourism a big deal to be exploited upon?
So we know that it is something that our hosts are increasingly looking at. So last year we actually signed a partnership with the Malaysia Green Technology Corporation, and that partnership was also intended for us to help reward certain types of listings that were already incorporating green practices into their stays. So we had, I think, a list of 12 different properties here in Malaysia that we selected and awarded. Beyond that, also we want to work with more hosts of more listings here in Malaysia to conduct workshops, for example, to teach them about how to incorporate green practices into their hosting practices.
So the 12 listings are, I don't know, is that a pilot case study situation?
It was based on a nomination basis. So we nominated, and a couple of different listings were nominated, and we wanted to reward them to help consumers also understand that different properties are adopting different types of green practices in their hosting behavior. Yeah.
We know that Airbnb is facing a few host of challenges in China particularly. Do you feel that that kind of challenges are seen in other markets, particularly the ones that you are responsible for?
So I think the challenges that we are seeing with the countries that I cover largely that the form of activity or the short-term rental accommodation industry in general is a relatively new phenomena. So in a lot of the countries that I cover, the idea of hosting somebody in a residential space is fairly new. And as a result of that, I think governments, local councils, state governments haven't really understood how to regulate the activity. So here in Malaysia, for example, we're seeing at the federal level, the state level, or the local council level, a lot of different local authorities are starting to look at regulating the industry. And so I think the place in which this is the most mature is in Penang, where discussions now are around how to regulate short-term rental in strata buildings in the state.
Okay. On top of this, we'll talk more about the short-term rental idea very shortly, but I still want to focus on the wider area of focus for you. The travel and tourism industry is moving forward towards sustainability. However, is there profit to be made there? And of course, when we look at some of the listings that you mentioned earlier, 12 nominated listings and perhaps some other listings that might be added on in this, do you feel that there could be putting on a strain towards profitability and margins when it comes to listings?
I think adopting green practices is not something that necessarily results in a strain on profits. I think it's sometimes it's also just about simple things that you can do to reduce your footprint, for example, your use of plastics, for example. So instead of giving like small toiletries in your listing, why not buy something like a bigger thing that's refillable instead? So I think with a lot of green practices that we encourage hosts to adopt, it's largely thinking about these small touch points that help to make their hosting practice greener while also not putting a huge amount of strain on themselves.
Okay, we'll go for one short break. When we come back, we'll discuss a little bit more with Mich Goh of Airbnb. Thanks for staying on with us. I have with me in the studio, all the way from Singapore, I guess it makes sense because you are in the travel industry, so she travels a lot. Mich Goh, the Airbnb Head of Public Policy for Southeast Asia, Hong Kong and Taiwan. Mich, let's talk a little bit more about the collaboration that you guys are doing with the Penang State Government, considering that they have announced last year its intent to propose new guidelines to limit STRA activities in strata buildings. Could you give us a little bit more background to this and how you guys are approaching this regulatory requirement?
Yeah, of course. So Penang State Government in July last year released draft guidelines that looked at certain restrictions in strata buildings in the state. So they were thinking about introducing a couple of things. One is a 180 night cap per year, as well as a 3-day maximum limit on the length of stays in strata buildings hosted on short-term rental. The other thing that they were also proposing is a outright ban on STRA in residential strata buildings, as well as rules around how, as in basically decisions that had to be made at the strata commercial building level to allow for short-term rental. So we provided a pretty comprehensive document in terms of feedback to the Penang State Government, sort of explaining to them that these types of rules, outright bans and night caps were not helpful to the state, especially at a time where tourism is just starting to recover and at a time where guests are looking for a variety of accommodation options when they travel into Penang.
I want to learn a little bit more on this because is this peculiar just to the Penang state? What about other states in Malaysia?
So I think other states have started thinking about regulating short-term rental as well, and they've started thinking about rules and guidelines that they could put in place. But I think Penang State has come the furthest in terms of suggesting and putting in place guidelines that are almost at the stage of being approved already by the State Council. Yeah.
Maybe you can share with us a little bit more about the situation in Singapore and how other countries, at least in Southeast Asia, is benchmarking against that.
Yeah, so I think other countries in Southeast Asia are also studying the issue. So short-term rental is also popular in other countries in Southeast Asia. And as popularity increases, that's when also government tends to start looking at regulating. But I don't think any of the other governments in Southeast Asia have gone as far as to already have a document that they are in the process of approving or passing to govern the activity. So Penang is actually coming the furthest along. But to be clear, I think regulations are actually a good thing for everybody involved in the industry. But what we're really focused on trying to communicate with the Penang State Government is that these regulations have to be simple to understand and effective in governing the activity.
Not to mention enforcement and a high degree of compliance in that sense.
Yeah.
There's no point having guidelines if it's not complied. I still want to focus on this one as well. How does this impact travel within the constrictions of the new regulations that has been introduced by, say, for instance, the Penang State Government?
Yeah, so I think if passed and adopted by buildings in the state, the guidelines would effectively limit the variety of options that a potential guest into the Penang State would have when they're thinking about traveling to the state.
Okay.
So if you're a family, for example, and you're traveling with grandmother, a couple of children, you would require a larger space and you would look for amenities like a washing machine, a kitchen. You also would want a living space to hang out with your larger family. And short of providing, with the kind of bans that the Penang State Government is considering, it would limit the options for these types of travelers when they are thinking about traveling to the state. Another example also is, for example, remote work. So I think Malaysia has been thinking about promoting the country and Penang State also as a location for digital nomads to work out of. Digital nomads usually look for a range of amenities like washing machine as well, a desk with high-speed internet, and residential properties are largely suited for this sort of activity because they would largely stay 3 to 4 weeks, maybe even longer. So with the 180 night cap per year plus 3-day limit on the number of stays that can happen in strata buildings, it would limit the ability of a remote worker to find an accommodation that they can stay in when they want to visit the state.
Okay, we'll go for one more short break. When we come back, we'll discuss a bit more with Mich Goh of Airbnb. Thanks for staying on. I have with me Mich Goh of Airbnb. We're talking about short-term rental accommodation issues, particularly in Penang and perhaps the rest of the nation. Let's talk a little bit more into why Penang State Government wants to do this. I really want to know why. I have no idea. This is not my forte.
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of reasons why government wants to regulate, and I think a lot of times regulation is not a bad thing, right? It provides clarity for all stakeholders involved.
No, I absolutely disagree. More regulations means more peculiarities towards businesses and consumers trying to understand how things work. It's just
Yeah,
I'm not a
so
fond.
I think
I'm not fond
the
of,
point is that the regulations need to be simple and
hands
effective.
on my government, but yes.
Yeah, they need to be simple and effective, and then people need to understand how
Nothing
they
that
work.
the government do is super effective. But yes, go on.
So I think what they're trying
We're
to
not
do
in
is to
Singapore, so we
provide
can
greater
clash.
clarity
Yes.
around what can be done within the short-term rental space and what kind of boundaries there are involved with the activity.
It sounds like there's a lot more regulations in place.
It's in the process of being passed, but right now what we're saying is that under existing regulations, like for example the Strata Management Act, every building already has the ability to pass bylaws that are tailored for the realities in their building.
Yeah.
So if a building decides like, hey, I want every guest to be registered with the security, for example, they already have the means to go and do so.
Then why this extra step, in your opinion, considering that you're not the spokesperson for the state government?
So I wouldn't want to hazard to guess what their motivations are, but yeah, I think our point now is just to share with them best practice from around the world as well, and also to suggest a couple of options that they can think about as they think about
Speaking of which,
changing
what are the best practices around the world? I understand that New York, for instance, is not very friendly towards Airbnb. What about other areas?
So I think there are different cities, different parts of the world all have different challenges or issues that they face. So whenever we think about regulations, we always go and speak with local authorities and local governments to help them understand that depending on the issues or challenges that they're trying to solve for, there are different types of things that you could consider. But I think some baseline things that we usually share in terms of best practices is one, for example, a simple online registration model. So in many instances, governments always want to know who is hosting, where they are hosting. And because people who are hosting an Airbnb listing are usually individuals, they need a process that is simple for them to understand and easy for them to do. So a simple online registration system is the way to go if you want to encourage greater compliance. That's one clear thing.
Okay. If we want to talk about safety of hosts as well as guests, Airbnb throughout the past decade has gone through pains trying to explain how things like this can actually be improved upon. A quick Google search with Franceschi online, and he would go at length on explaining the kind of ideas of how safety is the top priority for both hosts as well as guests. It's also important for Airbnb to actually explain in terms of how the protection is going to be given to host, particularly on insured property, and of course the liability limitations that the host has on the safety of guests. Those are the kind of ideas that has been discussed at length for the past decade. I'm still wondering why local governments, say for instance in Penang, are still adamant in trying to introduce more regulations in order for them to, I guess, in pursuit of trying to protect better regulations towards hosts as well as guests. Why do you think governments are non-stop and relentless in trying to introduce more regulations to a point where it's becoming a bit, not just redundant, particularly ridiculous actually at this point in time?
So I think that at the end of the day, like what you said, safety is of the number one priority. I'm sure it's the top of mind for everybody involved, from government to host to guests to us as a platform as well.
Yeah.
My guess is that, we've taken a lot of steps as a platform, like you've mentioned, to ensure safety on the platform. Maybe perhaps government thinks that they also have a role to play, and they also want to make sure that there is a baseline standard of safety when it comes to short-term rental.
And because of this, do you think that more regulations are in store for this kind of industry?
I think that we will probably end up in a space where short-term rental activities are regulated. I again don't think it's a bad thing. Like, I think it's about making sure that they are easy to understand and that they are effective.
Okay.
Yeah.
You really think so? More regulation is good?
I think it's not about just more, right? It's what type of regulation we're considering exactly.
All right, so let's talk about the types of regulation that is needed then.
Yeah, so I think in Penang, for example, instead of considering a all-out ban in strata residential buildings, perhaps the government can instead consider just using the existing mechanisms already and encouraging buildings to pass their own bylaws that are building specific and that cater to building specific requirements. That allows hosts to continue hosting, to continue enjoying the economic benefits that they would get from the hosting activity. It will allow potential guests into Penang State to be able to get the kind of accommodation that they want, while making sure that the needs of the building and the community continue to be protected.
Is in Singapore like this as well? I'm trying to get some Hong Kong areas where it's high density, a lot of strata requirements are there.
So Singapore and Hong Kong both don't have very specific short-term rental regulations, so they're applying older regulations to the activity. So In Singapore, for example, the regulation that they're applying is a minimum rental period, which applies to long-term tenancy agreements instead. But I think every city has its own challenges, so which is why also, and I think we even believe that every building has its own challenges, which is why we are encouraging the Penang state government to look at existing strata management rules which already allow for governance to happen at a building level.
Do you feel that Airbnb is facing a lot of, fight when it comes to trying to get the right regulations up and running in order for both the industry as well as government can actually execute the kind of liabilities that they require?
So we've always worked cooperatively with government at all levels. Like, for example, when the federal government was looking at this issue,
Which federal government?
The one in February 2019. So but when they were looking at that, when they were looking at the industry, I think they had already started to recognize the benefits of the short-term rental industry, and we worked a lot with them to share feedback from our hosts. We shared best practices from around the world. We think that we should be sharing these types of information, and we should be working cooperatively with local authorities. We also know that other parts of the industry are starting to share their own feedback. So in Penang, for example, we saw hosts sharing feedback. We saw guests also sharing feedback. There are also industry associations now that represent the interests of vacation rental owners or short-term rental owners who are also providing feedback to government. So also encourage government to listen to feedback from all channels and to...
they won't listen. So February 2019 was 4 years ago. What progress has been made since then?
So actually, I think I got the dates wrong. It was February 2020 that the draft guidelines came out. But I think if you think back to 3 years ago, that was right before the pandemic happened. So of course, the attention of the government was focused on other areas, and so we also think that at the national level, there should be a renewed interest in looking at these guidelines again, given that travel is coming back into Malaysia and people are looking for a variety of types of accommodation.
Having said that, what is the real-world implication of this, considering that while the government, both state and federal, are introducing new regulations that might not necessarily be flavorful, I guess, for this industry? Has this impacted travel?
I don't think it's directly impacted travel yet because all of these still remain discussions that are happening. But I think it sends a signal to people, right? Like if you do.
I have no idea that this was going on until I spoke to you. So I have no idea. So
I think when someone is looking for accommodation when they want to travel, they want to make sure that they have a variety of options, that they have a type of accommodation that suits their needs. So any kind of regulations that restrict the ability for someone to find something that they need will not be great for a destination.
And that is in theory, but in practice, has that been seen?
So I don't know the numbers specifically, but so right now I think we're continuing to look at it closely.
Okay, moving forward, what are we looking at when it comes to public policy initiatives by Airbnb? Of course, regulation discussion with federal and state authorities are in the offing, but generally speaking, what more is going to be seen from the policy level from Airbnb in this region for this year?
Yeah, so we've always looked at partnering cooperatively with governments, and we know that we are an increasingly big player in the tourism industry. We know also that our hosts are listing in places that are off the beaten path, that may be a bit further out from the typical tourist areas.
Yeah, but that's the idea, right? I mean, if I wanted the touristy idea.
So partnerships, I think, centered around helping more people outside of typical tourist areas to become Airbnb hosts, to share their homes and to reap the economic benefits of the travel recovery is something that we'll continue to look at.
Do you feel that the market is actually quite well entrenched and fully aware of Airbnb's offering after all these years?
I think that we are known as a platform that provides unique and interesting accommodation. So when someone is thinking of somewhere interesting for them to stay, be it a castle or a tree house or a villa by the beach, I think they would turn to Airbnb.
And because of this, you continue to see the growth of Airbnb, I guess, quite positive in the years to come, considering that we're looking at resumption of travel?
So people will always have a desire for unique experiences when they travel, and I hope that they will turn to Airbnb when they think about that.
Okay, fantastic. Final word. What about your own plans when it comes to your work here in this part of the world? What would be some of the discussions that you think is important to be had with the various governments in the various markets that you operate in?
Yeah, so I think two major things for us. One is around seeking more partnerships to enable more parts of countries to experience the benefits of travel. So instead of focusing just on the main tourist hotspots in countries, we're looking at partnerships that can help us to also extend the reach to outside of the typical hotspots. The other thing that we're also looking at, and this is a pretty big piece, is short-term rental regulatory reform.
Why you introduce big
So-
piece like right at the end of the interview? You
I
should
mean,
have-
but we've
you
talked
should have led with this.
we've talked extensively about this. So continuing to work cooperatively with government to share best practices about regulations.
Are they listening to
share
you?
feedback. I think that they are, and I think there is a willingness to listen. And
Willingness to listen, yeah lah. I
Yeah.
mean, but you know, to properly hear you out.
I mean, we
guess.
will have to keep trying for sure. Yeah.
Okay, as you can see, there's a lot of work that needs to be done when it comes to Airbnb public policy, but that was our conversation with Mich Goh of Airbnb. She's in charge of the public policy of Southeast Asia as well as Hong Kong and Taiwan. And of course, if you want to learn more about this, continue to stay with us on Astro AWANI. My name is Ibrahim Sani. Catch you in the next one.